When we think about participles, we have begun with the continuous or present participle. We've looked at the aorist or undefined participle. And both of these chapters have helped us to think about participles as verbal adjectives. They have qualities of both verbs and adjectives, and they have functioned adverbially, that is to modify verbs. We've thought already about each of these participles, the continuous and the undefined, as modifying verbs. They are verbal in that they are formed from a verb in the tense stem, and they have voice. They're also adjectives. They agree with the noun they modify, matching case number and gender. So this is review. And we've thought about translation and exegesis. And so what we are going to look at here in chapter 29 with the adjectival participle involves not so much parsing, not decisions about case number, gender. We know that pretty much from the word, but how we think about the word in translating it and in exegesis. So when we think about these adverbs, again, there are several nuances of an adverbial participle. It can be temporal, that is, it can say something about the time of the verb, or the time that that's going on, or the participle in relation to the verb. It can modify the cause as to why something is happening, purpose, manner, means, and so on. So we've thought about this already. But now we want to think about participles not only in their terms of verbal adjectives. They can function adverbally in modifying verbs, but they can also function adjectivally. That is, they can be attributive or have an attributive relationship or describe an attribute of a noun, or they can be substantival themselves as adjectives that function as a verbal adjective and replace a noun, if you will, and have a verbal element to that. So to review, we've already thought about participles as adverbs, functioning adverbally, if you will. Now, adjectivally. We've already thought number one here about modifying verbs. Now we're going to move on and think about modifying nouns, or in the situation of a substantival adjective, actually replacing a noun, being a substantive for it. So, again, to review, adverbial, the present and continuous, the aorist or undefined participles that we have looked at, they modify verbs. While, temporal, after temporal, causal, remember means, manner, the list that we've looked at already. One thing to note, and this helps us right away to begin to identify what kind of a participle it is adverbial participles never have an article. They never have the article in front of them. So if you don't see an article, there's a possibility it's adverbial. But articular participles are never adverbial. Anarthrous, possibly. Articular, never. So that's review. So now let's move on a bit. Adjectival participles. Adjectival participles can be attributive or substantive. If they are attributive, they act as an adjective describing an attribute of the noun they modify. And they are easy to find in the sense that we can identify their case number and gender, and there's agreement with the noun that participle modifies. There has to be agreement. So if you see a participle, you notice the tense formative nutau or usa or mene or theson or whatever the tense formative and participle morpheme combination might be. And you notice that there's also a noun that participle agrees with in case, number, and gender, and it modifies it. Well, attributive adjective. Think attributive adjective, it's describing an attribute of that noun. On the other hand, that participle might be substantive. It's actually functioning as a noun, and its case, number, and gender do not match a noun in that clause or sentence because that substantive is the noun. And the author uses that participle in a sense of a noun, but also combined with the action sense of a verb. It's a participle in a robust sense, if you will. Let's fill in the gaps just a bit further here. The attributive adjective modifies the noun that it agrees with in case, number, and gender, and we translate it who or which. So there's this noun, this person, place, thing, or idea, and then there's a participle, and it's modifying this noun. So we say this noun, who, which, or what, does this, is this, acts this way. The adjectival participle functions attributively to that noun by describing an attribute of it. On the other hand, participles might be substantive, and here the participle doesn't modify anything, it functions in and of itself. Here, as a noun, it's a case, number, and gender determined by how the author uses that participle, and often the substantival participle is signaled by an article. It's articular. In many, many cases, the substantival participle is articular, or if to say it another way, if you see an articular participle, there's a chance, a good chance, it's substantive, but not always. So it functions in and of itself. Looking at this chart, 2 or 3 things need to be said. First, to repeat what was stated earlier, when we're translating and we're doing exegesis, we look at the sentence, we find the verb, and we begin to translate that. If we notice a participle, we begin to think about the relationship between that participle and the verb. And we first ask, is this participle modifying the verb in some way? Is it saying something about it? Or is it modifying a noun? Is its case, number, and gender identical to a noun in that clause or that sentence? In the relative pericope of text, though they're not often that far away, normally it's in the clause or sentence. And if this participle modifies or agrees with the noun in case, number, and gender, good chance it's adjectival and attributive. It's stating an attribute of the noun. Many cases, though, it's substantive, and it has an article in many of those cases, and it functions in and of itself. And we'll see some of these here in some examples of exegesis. We have noted in some instances how these participles can be identified immediately by their tense formatives. And here in Hebrews 13:20, we have the aorist tense, ha-anagagon, of this participle from ago, ha de theaste serenes, ha anagagon, ek nekron, ton poimena, ton probaton, ton megon, en chymati diathekes ioniou, ton kyrion hemoni esun, ketertisai humas en panti agatho, es ta poesai ta thelema autu, poion en hemen ta euariston enopion autu, dia Jesu Christu, kohe doxa es tus ionos, amen. The anagagon, a participle, nominative case, singular, masculine, and here it's substantival. And you'll notice that most nominative case articular participles are substantival. They are nouns in of themselves, but they function in this way to describe an action as well. The one raising up from the dead, Jesus, the great shepherd of the sheep, with the blood of the eternal covenant, equip you, verse 21, to do all that's good, and to equip you in all good to do his will, I should say. Poion, here's the next participle. Here again, we have a nominative, but in this case, there's no article, and it's adverbial, describing perhaps the means by working in us that which is pleasing before him through Jesus Christ. So poion here, adverbial. One other example, and this is from the workbook, number 20 on page 116, from John 5. And you can see here a number of participles. And you can stop this recording at any point here and just tease these out for yourself. But you'll notice an adjectival substantival, an attributive participle, and each of these described. It's just a brief translation here as well. Notice the substantivals in verse 25 there. Often when a substantival, a participle will follow a clause, a temporal clause, as in verse 25 there, hate, and then a participle that's articular, that's going to be a clue right away for a substantival participle. And hoi accusantes as well, those hearing, and then the verb, they will live, zesusen. So you can take a look at those and work through them, and as you make decisions about participles, the need to identify them as adjectival or adverbial helps in translation especially.